If you're hearing this, you're still breathing. That makes you lucky. Now get up, because luck doesn't last forever." The voice crackled through the ship-wide comms, distorted by failing systems and punctuated by the sporadic hiss of venting coolant. Lieutenant Varric Kane barely registered it through the dense fog in his skull. Blood trickled down his temple, hot and sticky against his skin. He forced his eyes open. A sharp pain flared in his ribs as he inhaled the scorched air, heavy with something bitter. Burnt polymer, smoldering circuitry, and the unmistakable coppery tang of human suffering. The emergency lights pulsed in uneven flickers, stuttering between darkness and a sickly red glow. Somewhere down the corridor, someone groaned, a raw, rattling sound that sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through Kane's exhausted body. He tried pushing himself up. A sharp protest from his left arm told him something was either fractured or damn close to it. He gritted his teeth and planted his good hand against the cold deck, pressing up just as another voice cut through the wreckage. "Repeat. We are not secure. We have casualties. Structural integrity compromised, reactor shielding at 37% and dropping." Kane's head snapped toward the sound. A crewman slumped against the bulkhead near a shattered heads-up display, his uniform streaked with ash and deep crimson. Joris Venn, one of the medtechs. His breathing was uneven, his fingers pressed desperately against a wound on his side. Kane reached for him, ignoring the fresh jolt of pain across his ribs. "How bad?" Kane rasped, his throat raw as if he'd swallowed fire. Venn's bloodied fingers trembled. "Depends." He exhaled a shuddering breath. "You asking about me? Or the ship?" Kane's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, glancing at the display behind Venn. The data feed was corrupted, lines of garbled text stuttering across the laser plasma interface. But one thing was clear. Solace wasn't just wounded. It was dying. Another distant groan of shifting metal sent vibrations through the deck. Kane forced himself upright, bracing against the nearest wall. He dragged in a breath that tasted of scorched insulation and something metallic, thick and cloying in his lungs. How many? He scanned the corridor, his boots scraping against shattered fragments of reinforced plating. Venn grimaced. Alive? Maybe 24, scattered between the medbay and lower decks. We lost main power, backups on its last legs. Kane swore under his breath. 24 survivors on a crew of nearly 200. The numbers punched through his mind like a cold steel blade. Solace was a neutral hospital ship. No weapons, no military personnel besides a few security officers. It wasn't supposed to be a target, and yet someone had picked them apart with surgical efficiency. "Bridge?" Kane asked, already knowing the answer. Venn's silence confirmed it. A static-ridden pulse surged through the ship-wide comms again. Another voice, this one distant, fractured between bursts of failing transmission. "Classified. Trust no one." Kane's pulse kicked. He turned sharply, his boots slipping slightly against the blood-slicked deck. A part of his mind screamed at the impossibility of it. The encrypted channels shouldn't have been active. Not after that kind of hit. Someone else was still alive. His grip tightened against the cold steel of the bulkhead. "Where's that transmission coming from?" Venn tilted his head toward the remains of the corridor. "Lower decks, near the comm relay." Kane clenched his jaw. If the lower decks were broadcasting, that meant someone had overridden the ship's auto-lockdown. And that meant... His thoughts cut short as the bulkhead at the far end of the passage groaned violently, the metal warping inward. The sound was wrong, too sudden, too intentional. Something was outside. A cold weight settled in his gut. Kane had been in too many battlefields to mistake that sound for random structural failure. Someone was cutting through the hull. "Venn, move!" Kane pulled him up with his good arm, the medic staggering under his own weight. "We need to reach the lower decks. Now!" Venn let out a breathless, humorless laugh. "You realize we have no weapons, right?" "Not yet," Kane muttered, dragging him forward. The corridor was a graveyard of wreckage and bodies. Kane forced himself to not look too long at the faces he recognized. At the way, the emergency strobes made their wounds look fresh, still glistening under the pulse of crimson light. They passed a collapsed bulkhead where the ship's security locker should have been. Kane pried open the bent panel, fingers searching for anything usable. Most of the standard-issue stun rifles were gone, probably ripped apart in the explosion that took out the bridge. But tucked in the back, behind a half-melted containment unit, his fingers closed around a plasma torch and a reinforced pry bar. Not much, but enough. Ven eyed the tools skeptically. "You planning on welding someone to death?" Kane didn't answer. He just kept moving. They reached the lift access leading down to the lower decks, only to find the entrance jammed, the frame warped from the blast. Kane's pulse pounded in his ears. Time was running thin. From somewhere behind them, deep in the ship's bowels, a new sound joined the chorus of failing machinery. A hollow rhythmic clang, boarding hooks. Kane cursed and jammed the plasma torch against the lift's manual release panel. The metal sizzled, dripping molten residue as the safety lock disintegrated. With a heave, he and Ven forced the doors open just enough to squeeze through. The emergency ladder shaft stretched down into darkness. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying the unmistakable stench of burning polymer and something organic, something wrong. "We go down," Kane said. Ven let out a wheezing breath. "I hate this plan." Kane slung the pry bar across his back and grabbed onto the rungs. "Get used to it." They descended in silence, their breaths shallow, each creak of metal setting Kane's nerves razor-sharp. Halfway down, a distant hiss echoed above them, not the ship's vents. Something harsher. Ven tensed. That's an airlock breach." Kane's grip tightened. The enemy wasn't cutting through the hull anymore. They were already inside. His feet hit the lower deck with a muted thud. He turned sharply, dragging Ven down beside him as he slammed his hand against the manual door controls. The panel flickered. For a split second, Kane saw the laser plasma display flash a priority message. Decryption in progress. Priority transmission located. Survivors at risk. Trust no one. Then the screen cut to black. Something shifted in the darkness beyond the door. And Kane knew whoever was inside wasn't human. The dark pulsed. Not just with absence, but with something else, something moving. Kane's heartbeat slowed, sharpening into a quiet, deadly rhythm. The door's control panel flickered once, then stilled, its plasma display lifeless, as if whatever had touched it had burned through more than just code. The hairs at the back of his neck stiffened. A breath, not his, not Ven's. Something else, something deeper in the corridor ahead, exhaling slow, deliberate. The air wasn't still. It carried a scent now, faint but present, something like charred protein and wet copper. Kane's grip on the pry bar tightened. This wasn't an echo of the ship dying. This was something inside, listening. Ven shifted beside him, his movements careful, controlled. He'd felt it too. Kane's mind raced through possibilities. Alien scavengers wouldn't be this patient. Pirates would have already tried to pick apart the remains. And no faction he knew used boarding techniques this subtle. Who the hell was in his ship? The only way to answer that was to move. Kane lowered himself into a crouch, motioning Ven to stay close. The darkness wasn't total. Occasional flashes from flickering heads-up displays cast erratic, ghostly glows along the corridor walls. Pools of red and orange light slithered over the scattered debris, broken gurneys, and slumped bodies. Shadows warped unnaturally against the bulkheads, shifting with the slow spin of Solace's dying emergency lighting. Footsteps, software deliberate, coming from ahead, where the transmission had originated. Ven's breath hitched, barely audible, but Kane caught it. He turned his head just enough to meet the medic's eyes and mouthed a single word, "Run." Ven hesitated. Kane didn't. He shot forward, boots silent against the deck, pry bar raised. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, a shape darted from the dark, moving low and fast. Kane twisted mid-step, barely avoiding the first strike. A jagged arc of something metallic swiping through the air where his throat had been a second before. Instinct took over. Kane pivoted on his heel, bringing the pry bar up in a brutal upward swing. The impact landed, bone or something close to it, cracked under the force, but the attacker didn't crumple. Instead, it lurched sideways, its movement unnatural, a jerky marionette motion that set every warning in Kane's body screaming. Not a scavenger. Not human. Kane didn't stop to assess. He pressed forward, slamming his shoulder into the thing's center mass. The weight was wrong. Too light, too wiry. It buckled, but its hand, 4 fingers, too long, too thin, lashed out, claws raking across Kane's forearm. A flash of heat, sharp pain, then wet warmth seeping down his wrist. Kane snarled and drove his knee into its side, forcing it off balance. The thing let out a noise. Not a scream, not a growl, but something in between. A guttural distortion of sound that vibrated in his ribs. Then it twisted, unnatural joints bending the wrong way, and launched itself into the darkness. Gone. Kane's breath came fast, sharp. His forearm burned. He ignored it, his eyes adjusting to the shifting shadows. Ven was already moving, pulling him toward the corridor where the signal had come from. Kane followed. They had seconds before whatever that was decided to come back. The doors to the comms relay had been forced open, not destroyed, peeled apart, as if something had crawled its way in with deliberate intent. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of burned circuits and something else, something that curdled Kane's gut before his brain could name it. The laser plasma displays flickered weakly, strings of corrupted data cascading in erratic bursts of light. And there, slumped against the main terminal, Lieutenant Attic Nor, or what was left of him. Kane froze. Nor's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his throat torn open, but it wasn't the wound that held Kane's breath captive. It was what had been done to his hands. Nor's fingers were still pressed to the terminal's interface, the skin blackened, cauterized. The flesh had fused to the controls, the synthetic nerve links scorched, but still active. The plasma display behind him flickered violently, as if someone, or something, had been forcing him to transmit even as he died. The message was still running, half deciphered. Decryption in progress, Solace compromised, classified logs accessed, intelligence at risk, medical neutrality, a lie, containment breached, terminate all witness. The words slammed into Kane's mind like a battering ram. Solace hadn't been a random target. This wasn't a simple attack. Someone, or something, had hunted them. Ven swore under his breath. What the hell does that mean? Terminate all witness? Who the hell sent that? Kane barely heard him. His focus locked onto something else. Nor's eyes were open, wide, staring. But the blood on his face wasn't his. It was dripping from the ceiling. Kane looked up. A shape clung to the upper bulkhead, pressed into the shadows where the emergency lights didn't reach. It had been waiting, watching. It moved. Kane dove, dragging Ven down as the thing dropped, landing in a crouch with a sickening crack of joints that weren't meant to bend that way. Now, Kane could see it. A humanoid silhouette, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its torso too narrow. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. No eyes, just smooth, dark indentations where a face should be. And its hands, Nor's blood still wet on its fingertips. It tilted its head as if studying them. Then it spoke. Not in a voice, not in a sound, in a transmission. Director, into their comms. You should not have survived. The words vibrated through Kane's skull, a cold electric sensation that crawled down his spine. Ven gasped, clutching his head. Get it out! Kane ignored the static clawing at his mind. His body moved before thought, reaching for the terminal, overriding Nor's dead grip, forcing the system to finalize the decryption. Data sequence complete. Classified files unlocked. Solace was never a hospital ship. The thing lunged. Kane slammed his hand onto the manual EMP override. The explosion of energy ripped through the comms relay, sending the creature screaming back into the dark. For the second time that day, Kane found himself gasping for air in the wreckage of something he barely understood. And this time, he knew for certain. Whatever had boarded Solace wasn't here for the survivors. It was here for the secrets. The EMP discharge had sent shockwaves through the comms relay, frying every unsecured circuit, leaving the room cloaked in flickering aftershocks of dying energy. For a brief moment, the static in Kane's skull dissipated, the alien psychic intrusion severed, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was a countdown. That thing wasn't dead. Kane staggered to his feet, breath ragged, muscles stiff with exertion. The metallic stench of burnt insulation curled through the air, clinging to his skin. Somewhere in the corridor beyond, the bulkheads groaned, something moving through the ship, navigating with an eerie, unnatural awareness. It wasn't running. It wasn't hunting. It was waiting. Ven coughed, pushing himself up from where he'd been thrown against a shattered heads-up display. Sparks danced along the cracked interface, the final remnants of Nor's decrypted data blinking on the screen. His voice was thin, shaken. "That thing! What the hell was that?" Kane wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, his mind already racing. Something had been here before them, embedded in the ship, and it had been guarding Solace's secrets like a keeper in the dark. "Not the question we need to ask," Kane murmured, gaze fixed on the broken console. Ven swallowed, wiping his trembling hands on his uniform. "Then what's the right question?" Kane exhaled sharply. "Who let it in?" Before Ven could respond, the ship's emergency proximity alarm shrieked to life, an ear-splitting klaxon of imminent collision. Kane and Ven exchanged a single look. Not now, not with that thing still inside. Kane bolted toward the corridor, dragging Ven with him. They raced through the ship's wounded corridors, their boots hitting the deck in uneven strides, dodging fallen beams, broken medical carts, the lifeless bodies of those who hadn't made it. They burst into the secondary operations bay, the last functional control hub left intact. The emergency lighting stuttered erratically, throwing shifting shadows against the bulkheads. A cracked laser plasma display showed multiple incoming ships, their trajectories locked onto Solace. Kane's stomach clenched. Ven leaned against the console, fingers tightening over the edge. "Tell me they're friendly." Kane's eyes flicked over the data streams. 3 ships. Their signatures didn't match any known allies. Their approach wasn't fast, but deliberate, controlled. They weren't a rescue. They were a claim. Kane activated the ship's external heads-up display, forcing the damaged sensors to render the incoming vessels. The first to breach the fog of wreckage was sleek, predatory, its hull blackened by deep space wear, marked with crimson insignias of a faction Kane recognized instantly. His blood went cold. "The Kresh Dominion," Kane muttered, jaw tightening. Ven blinked. "That's not possible. They don't target non-combatants." "Solace isn't a non-combatant anymore," Kane said darkly. "The Kresh Dominion, one of the oldest warring empires in the Galactic territories, notorious for their brutal conquests and calculated diplomacy. But they never wasted time on damaged ships. The only reason they'd be here—" Kane's grip tightened on the console. They knew. The Kresh weren't just here to scavenge the wreck. They were here for Solace's secrets. The comm signal flared, and a deep, layered voice came through, warped by static. "Solace, you are compromised. Surrender the vessel, and you will not be annihilated." Kane's fingers curled into fists. The arrogance in that voice. The Kresh weren't asking. They were stating. Ven shook his head, his expression bleak. "They think we're a loose end." "No," Kane corrected. His pulse pounded in his skull. "They think we're a loose weapon, and they want to be the ones to wield it." The ship shuddered beneath them, an external force locking onto the hull, attempting to force a breach. Kane moved. He activated the manual defense protocols, knowing full well Solace wasn't built for combat. It had minimal shielding, emergency countermeasures, no weapons capable of repelling an invasion force. But it didn't need them. Kane's mind flashed back to the decrypted files. The hospital ships were never neutral. They had been built for more than just diplomacy. They were vaults of intelligence. Kane's breath slowed. His thoughts locked into strategy. If the Kresh wanted Solace, they wanted its data. That meant they wouldn't destroy it outright. They needed to believe they had control. Kane turned to Ven. "Get to the medbay. Find every survivor who can stand and move. We need bodies in engineering, in navigation, anywhere that still has a working console." Ven hesitated. "What the hell are you planning?" Kane's gaze flickered back to the display where the Kresh warships loomed just outside range. "We let them in." Ven's breath hitched. That's the only way we survive," Kane said coldly. We give them what they want, and we make sure they never leave with it. The ship shuddered again. The Kresh were getting impatient. Kane activated the docking override, forcing a controlled access point to open in Solace's lower hangar bay. He spoke directly into the comms, his voice steady, composed. Kresh Dominion, this is Lieutenant Jarek Kane of the Solace. We are unarmed. We will comply. A long pause. Then the transmission clicked through. Acceptable. You will not be harmed. Kane's lips curled in something that was not a smile. Number he wouldn't be, because the moment the Kresh set foot on this ship, they belonged to him. Ven swallowed hard, then exhaled, pushing away from the console. I really, really hope you know what you're doing. Kane didn't look at him. His focus was already elsewhere, on the corridors beyond, on the flickering displays, on the weight of the secrets buried inside Solace's steel bones. His voice was quiet, but the certainty in it was unshaken. They came to take something. His fingers grazed the control panel, activating the final fail-safe sequences buried in the ship's encryption. They just don't know they already lost. The docking clamps engaged. The Kresh were coming aboard. Kane exhaled once, steadying himself. The next move belonged to him. The docking clamps sealed with a metallic thunk, sending a tremor through Solace's battered frame. Kane stood at the main access corridor, watching the heads-up display as two squads of Kresh soldiers breached the airlock, their towering silhouettes moving with the practiced grace of a conquering force. Their armor gleamed under the ship's emergency strobes, the sickly red glow turning them into walking specters. He kept his posture loose, controlled. Fear made people sloppy, and right now he had to be anything but. Ven stood a few steps behind him, his breathing tight, his fingers twitching at his side. He had no weapon. Neither did Kane. It wasn't that kind of fight. Not yet. The first Kresh officer stepped forward, his gait slow, deliberate. Unlike his subordinates, he didn't wear a helmet. His pale, silver-scaled face was expressionless, his vertical pupils flickering between Kane and the damaged interior of the ship. He spoke in perfect, clipped Terran standard. Lieutenant Jarek Kane. Kane didn't move. I assume you're not here for medical assistance. The officer's lips curled slightly. A smirk, perhaps, if Kresh anatomy even allowed for it. I am Captain Jarek of the Kresh Dominion. You have something we require. Kane arched a brow, keeping his stance nonchalant. Funny, I was just about to say the same thing. A ripple of tension moved through the Kresh soldiers. Jarek studied him, as if weighing whether this was stupidity or strategy. Then he exhaled, a slow, measured sound. You are not in a position to negotiate. Kane smiled. It wasn't friendly. Neither are you. The words hung in the air, laced with the kind of quiet confidence that made people hesitate. Kane watched the flicker in Jarek's eyes, the slight unconscious calculation. The Kresh weren't sure what they were walking into, and that was exactly what he needed. Kane turned slightly, gesturing toward the corridor leading deeper into Solace. If you're here for the ship's records, you won't find them intact. The main comms were destroyed during the attack. But he let the sentence hang, the implication forming its own weight. There's a failsafe cache, stored in an isolated system. It'll take time to access. Jarek's expression didn't shift, but his pupils contracted. Where? Kane gestured toward the lower decks. Near engineering. It was a lie. The failsafe wasn't in engineering. It was buried beneath 3 layers of encrypted shielding, tied directly to the ship's AI core, the same core that had been forcibly shut down during the attack. And Kane had just given the Kresh a reason to walk straight into his trap. Jarek studied him a moment longer, then nodded. He gestured to 2 of his soldiers. You will take us there. If you attempt deception, you will not live long enough to regret it. Kane let his lips twitch in amusement. I'll do my best to be a gracious host. He turned, leading them down the corridor, the weight of armored footfalls following close behind. Ven moved beside him, his steps a fraction too stiff. Kane didn't glance at him, didn't need to. He knew what the medic was thinking. What the hell are you planning? He couldn't say it. Not yet. Not with 2 squads of Kresh warriors at his back, their fingers hovering over their rifles like predators waiting for the first sign of weakness. But he had one advantage. Jarek thought Kane was leading them toward the failsafe cache. He didn't realize Kane was actually leading them toward something else entirely. They reached the lower decks in silence. The emergency lighting flickered, casting long, broken shadows along the bulkheads. The air tasted of something old, something abandoned, like the ship itself had been holding its breath for too long. The Kresh soldiers moved with sharp efficiency, scanning every corner, every possible ambush point. Kane walked carefully, pacing his breathing, keeping his posture controlled. Then he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, the click of something not human. Kane's pulse slowed. Jarek didn't notice. But the thing that had been hiding in Solace, the thing that had torn through Lieutenant Noor and slipped into the dark like a whisper, it was here. And Kane had just led an entire squad of highly trained, overconfident soldiers straight into its hunting ground. The air shifted, a flicker of movement above. Then, the lights died. The corridor plunged into absolute blackness. The first scream was wet, sudden. Then the gunfire erupted. Kane moved. He ducked, twisting against the bulkhead as something heavy slammed into the soldiers behind him. The impact sent bodies crashing against metal, weapons discharging blindly into the dark. He caught a glimpse, just for a second, as the emergency strobes flickered. The thing was among them. Not running, not dodging, tearing. Kresh armor buckled like paper. A hand, too long, too thin, punched through the plating of a soldier's chest, pulling him into the dark before he could even scream. Another burst of gunfire illuminated the corridor in flashing bursts. More shapes, not just one, two, three, more. Jarek barked orders, his voice a sharp, animalistic command, but his soldiers were already falling, their weapons useless against things that moved faster than thought. Kane grabbed Ven, yanking him back toward the access hatch. The shrieks behind them were not human. Jarek turned, eyes wild with fury. "You!" Kane didn't let him finish. He slammed his palm against the nearest control panel, triggering the emergency containment protocol. The blast doors came down, cutting off the Kresh soldiers, cutting off whatever was inside that corridor, leaving only silence. Kane exhaled. His hands were shaking. Ven was pale, his chest heaving. "You planned that." Kane swallowed. His throat was raw. "Not exactly." Ven exhaled sharply. "What now?" Kane turned toward the heads-up display. The emergency lockdown had bought them time, but not much. "Now?" His voice was quiet. "We find out what's really inside this ship." Because Kane knew something now, something that changed everything. The Kresh hadn't come for Solace's intelligence. They'd come because they already knew about the things inside it. And now, Kane was trapped inside with them. The bulkheads trembled, carrying the distant echoes of dying men. Kane stood motionless, his breath shallow, his pulse a slow, controlled beat in his ears. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows against the sealed blast doors. Nothing moved beyond them. No more gunfire, no more screams, just absence. Ven leaned against the wall beside him, hands braced against his knees, his face pale beneath the dried streaks of blood and sweat. He exhaled slowly. "Whatever was in there," Ven muttered. "It's done now." Kane didn't answer, because he knew better. This wasn't done, not even close. The Kresh hadn't been hunting those things. They'd been running from them, and now Kane had locked himself in with whatever the Dominion had been so desperate to contain. Ven straightened, dragging a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "Kane, I swear, if you tell me that was part of some grand plan—" Kane turned toward the laser plasma display embedded into the corridor wall. The damage had left most of the system fractured, but the ship's bioscanners still worked, and they were screaming. Readings spiked everywhere. "Ven," Kane said quietly. The medic followed his gaze. His face tightened. "That's not the Kresh, is it?" Kane shook his head. The thing they'd seen earlier, the one that had torn Noor apart like wet paper. It hadn't been alone. There were more. And they weren't hiding anymore. A shuddering vibration crawled through the floor. A soundless ripple of movement somewhere beneath them. Not footsteps, not machinery. Something deeper, something alive. Kane clenched his jaw. His options were bleeding out faster than his luck. His hands curled into fists. The failsafe cache was still locked down, buried beneath layers of encryption. But that meant something else. Whoever had shut the AI core down had done it on purpose. Which meant... Kane's breath halted. There was still a traitor on board. His mind snapped through possibilities. Ven was the only one with him, but there were other survivors. Some of them still in the lower decks, engineers, technicians, medics. One of them had known. One of them had let this happen. The laser plasma display flickered violently, static rippling over the feed. Then a voice, garbled, distorted, unmistakably human, broke through the white noise. Containment failed. They are awake. A pause. The silent witness must not survive. Kane went still. Ven froze beside him, his head turned, slow, cautious. What the hell does that mean? Kane didn't respond. He didn't have to, because he already knew. Solace hadn't been attacked. It had been purged, and whoever had done it was still here. He pivoted on his heel, eyes scanning the corridor. The emergency lighting warped the bulkheads in shifting reds and golds, but nothing moved. No figures. No sounds, but the distant groaning of the ship's structure. Ven, Kane said carefully, where's the rest of the survivors? Ven swallowed. Medbay, some in lower storage. Why? Kane's jaw locked. We need to get to them, now. Something moved behind them, a whisper of fabric against steel. Kane turned, too late. A sharp, violent impact slammed into his side, sending him crashing against the bulkhead. His vision exploded in white heat, his ribs screaming as he hit the deck. His hand shot toward his belt, but a boot pinned his wrist, pressing hard enough to warn him. A shadow loomed above him. Lieutenant Kane, a voice murmured, I was wondering when you'd figure it out. The pressure on his chest eased just enough for him to breathe. Kane blinked against the haze of pain, forcing his vision to focus. Chief Engineer Ranik stood above him, a sidearm leveled at his temple. Ven staggered back, eyes wide. Ranik, what the hell? The engineer didn't look at him. His gaze stayed on Kane, calculating, careful. You were supposed to be dead by now, Ranik murmured. The Dominion was meant to finish the job. But you... His lips curled, his tone almost amused. You're always too damn stubborn. Kane let out a slow breath. That, he said, voice low, cold, is probably what's going to kill you. He moved before Ranik could react. Kane twisted his trapped arm, grinding his wrist hard against the boot, pinning him. The shift in weight threw Ranik off balance, just enough for Kane to drive his knee into his gut. Ranik stumbled back, cursing. Kane was on his feet before he hit the deck. Ven lunged, trying to grab the gun. Ranik fired. The shot was wild, the impact bursting against the wall instead of flesh, but the shock sent Ven reeling. Kane didn't give Ranik a second chance. He slammed into him, forcing the barrel away from them, twisting his grip. Ranik fought, grappling hard, but Kane was faster. He wrenched the gun from Ranik's grip, flipped it, and drove the handle into his skull. The engineer collapsed. Kane's breathing was rough, sharp. He didn't take his eyes off him. Ven swallowed, his pulse hammering in his throat. Tell me, Kane said, voice quiet, what the hell you did. Ranik let out a low, rasping laugh, blood smearing his temple. I did what was necessary, he said. And now, so will they. Kane's blood went cold. He turned to the laser plasma display. The biosignature readings had changed. They weren't stationary anymore. They were moving. And they were coming straight for them. Kane's grip on the gun tightened. Ven exhaled, voice barely above a whisper. Tell me there's a plan. Kane's jaw clenched. Not yet. He turned his gaze to the dark corridor ahead. But there will be. Because now it wasn't just about surviving. Now it was about finishing this. Kane stood over Ranik's unconscious body, his grip tightening around the stolen sidearm. The engineer's last words echoed like a slow knife twisting between his ribs. And now, so will they. The heads-up display flickered erratically, biosignature readings shifting in real time. Whatever had been lying dormant inside Solace, the things that had torn through the creche, that had moved through the dark like whispers of something older, something hungry. They were no longer waiting. They were coming. Ven hovered by the console, his fingers digging into the edges of the metal like he needed to hold on to something real. Tell me you're seeing this. Kane exhaled slowly, forcing his pulse to settle into something sharp, something steady. I see it. Good, Ven said, because I'm pretty sure it sees us too. The deck shuddered beneath them, not from impact, but from movement. Something massive, something shifting within the ship's bones. Kane didn't hesitate. We need control of the AI core. He turned, striding toward the corridor, stepping over Ranik like he wasn't even there. Now! Ven scrambled after him. You said it was shut down. It was. Kane glanced back at the medic, which means someone was afraid of what it knew. Right, Ven muttered, adjusting his grip on the medkit strapped to his shoulder. And now we're walking straight toward it. Fantastic. The corridor stretched ahead, a jagged spine of flickering emergency strobes and curling smoke. Every step felt like walking across a fault line seconds before it broke. Kane barely registered the wreckage around them, the twisted remnants of stretchers, the shattered diagnostic equipment, the hollowed-out shells of rooms that had once been sterile, full of light. It wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a graveyard with a beating heart beneath its ribs. Ven caught up, his voice lower now. If Ranik knew what was on this ship, why the hell was he still alive? Kane didn't answer immediately. He'd been asking himself the same thing. Either Ranik had cut a deal with whoever had tried to purge Solace, or they had left him breathing for a reason. Kane wasn't sure which answer was worse. The entrance to the AI core chamber loomed ahead, sealed behind a reinforced bulkhead. No scorch marks, no forced entry. Whatever had hunted this ship, whatever had carved through its crew like an afterthought, hadn't touched this door. That bothered Kane more than he wanted to admit. He ran his hand over the manual override panel, brushing away a thin layer of dust. Inactive, not broken, not bypassed, just waiting. Ven shifted behind him, his voice edged with something sharp. Kane! The display lit up. A single line of text crawled across the screen, glowing in dim red font. Clearance accepted. Identity. Varric Kane. Kane stilled. Ven's breath hitched. That? Welcome back, Lieutenant. The bulkhead unlocked with a deep, resonant click. The door slid open. Cold air spilled from the chamber, rolling over their skin like something alive. Kane stepped inside first. The AI core was intact. Unlike the rest of Solace, this room had been untouched. The central processor loomed at the far end, a monolithic structure of dark alloy and flickering interface panels. The air held a stillness that felt manufactured, deliberate. Ven exhaled, low and careful. I don't like this. Then you're paying attention. Kane approached the central console, fingers skimming across the active displays. The data was still there, buried, locked under layers of encryption that felt old, layered in a way that wasn't just security but something deeper. He tapped the manual bypass. A string of distorted text flooded the screen. Then a voice, not artificial, not human, something between both, slid into the room. You should not have come back. Kane didn't flinch. Neither should you. The lights dimmed. A projection flickered into existence. Not the smooth blue of a standard interface, but a shifting, fractured silhouette of something that had once been designed to look human, but no longer tried. The AI's voice wove through the static. They were meant to burn this ship, to erase me. You were meant to die with it. Kane tilted his head, eyes locked on the projection. Yet here we are. The AI's form stuttered, warping into layered images. Here we are. Kane's fingers tightened on the console. Tell me what happened. The AI hesitated. You are not authorized. Kane gritted his teeth. Try me. A long pause. Then, files unlocked. Text scrolled in bursts, images. Classified reports that had never been meant to be seen. Ven leaned closer. What the hell is this? Kane scanned the data, his stomach twisting. It wasn't just intelligence. It was records, video feeds, experiment logs, footage of things that should have never been taken from black sites, things that had been found in the ruins of worlds lost before humanity ever touched the stars, and among them, images of the creatures that now stalked Solace. Kane's throat tightened. The AI's voice dropped into something lower. They were not prisoners. They were not experiments. The screen glitched. They were weapons. Ven let out a slow, unsteady breath. That's what the Kresh were afraid of. Kane's pulse pounded against his ribs. Not afraid. Responsible. They hadn't just found these things. They had made them. And now they had gotten loose. The ship shook violently, the lights flickering. The AI's projection warped, glitching in and out of coherence. They are already here. Kane spun toward the entrance. A shape stood in the doorway. Not human, not Kresh. Something else. Something that had been watching the entire time. Ven drew a sharp breath. The creature tilted its head, and then it smiled. The thing in the doorway was watching them. Its head tilted in slow, deliberate increments, the gesture too measured to be curiosity, too restrained to be hunger. It was studying them, testing something neither Kane nor Ven could see. The air felt charged, an unseen current rippling between them. Kane had felt this before, not in battle, not in survival, but in negotiation. This wasn't an immediate strike. It was a conversation. Kane's fingers hovered over the console's manual lockdown. He could seal the door, try to buy time. But if this thing could slip through the ship like a shadow, what was a door to it? The AI's projection flickered behind him, voice reduced to fragmented echoes. They have learned. They have adapted. You will not win with force. Kane's mind locked into strategy. Force wasn't the answer. Not here, not now. But the Kresh? The Kresh still thought it was. Kane let his fingers brush over the console controls, seemingly idle. In reality, he was rerouting every available feed into a silent transmission burst. Not just across Solace, but outwards, into open Kresh channels. If the Kresh had planned to bury this disaster quietly, then they were about to lose that option. The creature shifted. It took one slow step into the room, its body uncoiling with a deliberate ease that made Kane's stomach tighten. There was no wasted movement. It was testing proximity, gauging response. Kane didn't step back. You're not just killing to kill, are you? His voice was steady. The words were meant for the thing before him, but also for the feed he was broadcasting. The creature paused. A long moment passed. Then it spoke, not in sound, not in static, but in data. The heads-up display blinked violently, text flooding the screen. An intricate stream of code, military encryption, deep space relay coordinates. Kane's stomach dropped. This thing wasn't just loose. It had been transmitting. And it hadn't just been calling for its own kind. It had been communicating with something far beyond this sector. The realization slammed into Kane with the force of a railgun. It's not just surviving, he muttered. It's sending information. Ven's voice was tight. To who? Kane's mind snapped through the wider implications. If these things had been engineered, if they had been contained until now, and one of them had just sent an open relay out into space, they weren't looking at a loose experiment. They were looking at the opening shot of something much, much worse. Kane's strategy locked into place. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't stop what had already been sent. But he could make sure that every major power in the galaxy knew exactly what was coming. And that meant using the Kresh's paranoia against them. Kane's fingers flicked through the interface, setting the relay's output frequency to an open Kresh warband channel. Jarek would hear everything. Kane straightened, his voice carrying through the silent air. You knew the Kresh would come for you, didn't you? His tone was even, as if speaking to a prisoner in a diplomatic chamber, rather than an engineered nightmare standing 10 feet away. The creature tilted its head again, slower this time. Kane pressed further. But you didn't run. You let them in. His pulse hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. Because you wanted them to see. Another pause. Then the screen flared with a new burst of code. Not just them. Kane's breath stilled. It had never been about the creche. It had been about who the creche were afraid of. The display updated again. A star map, a trajectory, not random, targeted, straight toward one of the core Terran colonies. Ven let out a sharp breath. Oh, hell no. Kane's focus hardened. He turned to the interface, his mind moving faster than his pulse. He rerouted the ship's failing comms array, bouncing the signal through every old diplomatic relay tied to Earth's former outreach initiatives. He wasn't just sending a warning to the creche anymore. He was sending it to everyone. Classified data breach. Solace compromised non-Terran entities, transmitting to unknown contacts. Humanity is not the only target. The creature stepped forward. Kane met its gaze, not backing down, not giving ground. You wanted them to see? His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was absolute. Then I just made sure they all did. A new alert flooded the screen. External forces detected. Creche Dominion warships mobilizing. Galactic transmissions incoming. Kane exhaled. He had just set fire to the entire board. And now he was waiting to see who moved first. The display flared, warnings cascading across the interface. The entire board had changed. Kane had forced every major power to see the truth, shattered whatever fragile veil of secrecy the creche had woven around their mistake. And now the galaxy was watching, the creature standing before him, a thing engineered for conflict, for adaptation, for something deeper than survival, did not move. It had spoken to them in transmissions, in data, in quiet revelations it had chosen to share, not because it needed to, but because it had wanted them to understand. A quiet realization settled in Kane's chest, heavier than fear, sharper than strategy. It had never been the creche's secret to keep, and now it never would be again. The heads-up display pulsed again, incoming transmissions flooding the array. The creche were scrambling to suppress the fallout, but they weren't the only ones listening now. Terran Command had received the feed, so had the other Dominion factions, so had the independent warlords and those whose alliances swayed like reeds in a storm. Kane's pulse steadied. They weren't alone anymore. Ven exhaled beside him, voice tight, controlled. You just set the whole damn galaxy on fire. Kane's fingers hovered over the console. Maybe it needed burning. A new alert sliced through the others. Multiple warp signatures detected. Unauthorized vessels inbound. Unknown origin. Kane stilled. The creature turned its head as if listening to something only it could hear. The AI's voice crackled back into existence, disjointed but clear. It is too late to stop it now. Kane's jaw locked. Stop what? The display shifted, rendering a new scan. A massive anomaly opening just beyond the system's edge, too large for a single fleet, too unstable to be a natural occurrence. A tear in space. A gateway. Something answering the creature's call. The AI's form flickered, voice laced with static. They were never meant to remain hidden. You were never meant to find them. Kane didn't breathe, because this wasn't just about the creche anymore. Something else had been watching, waiting, and now it was coming. Ven stepped back, his eyes locked on the screen. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Kane's hands flexed at his sides. It's worse, he muttered. Another alert flashed. External comms override. Someone was hijacking the open channels. A new voice bled into the transmission, cold, unfamiliar, but listening. We have received your message, Terran. You were not meant to see. You were not meant to interfere. Ven's skin paled. Kane's fingers curled into a fist. Guess that makes me a problem, doesn't it? Silence. Then, yes. A new ripple of movement in the corridor beyond. The creche weren't just scrambling now. They were abandoning their claim on Solace. Kane could see it happening in real time. Ships breaking formation, warping out in silent retreat. They had known. They had known exactly what was buried here. And now that it had been unleashed, they wanted no part in it. Ven's voice was hoarse. Kane, what the hell do we do? Kane exhaled. He'd always known this fight wouldn't be waged in weapons alone. He turned back to the creature before him. You called them. His voice was steady even. But that wasn't your choice, was it? A pause. The creature's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. No. Kane's mind locked into the only play left. This thing, this engineered weapon, it had wanted them to see, to understand, to know what had been hidden. And now it had lost control, just like the Kresh had before it. Kane could use that. You said we weren't meant to see, Kane said, his voice carrying through the ship. But we do now. All of us. The transmissions were still open. The whole galaxy was still listening. Kane stepped forward, gaze locked onto the thing before him. You called them, he said again. But what if they found something waiting for them they didn't expect? The creature tilted its head, as if considering. You don't want to be leashed again, Kane continued. You don't want to be used. He let the words sink like iron into deep water. Neither do we. The creature watched him. Ven tensed beside him. Kane, this is insane. Kane's voice didn't waver. Maybe. A long silence. Then the creature moved, not toward them, toward the console. The heads-up display shifted, new data flowing into the stream. The warping anomaly at the edge of the system pulsed. Then, a new signal emitted from Solace. Not a distress call, a counter call. A disruption in the relay. A shutdown command. Kane didn't move, didn't breathe. The anomaly began to collapse. Whatever had been answering the call was cut off. Ven exhaled sharply, stepping back. That actually worked? Kane didn't answer, because the creature turned to him again. And this time, it spoke aloud. Your war is coming, Terran. But not today. Kane met its gaze. Number not today. The ship shuddered one last time, then fell silent. Outside, the Kresh ships were gone. The transmissions had ended. The war that could have started today had been delayed. Not avoided, not prevented. But Kane had changed the game. He turned away from the console, rolling his shoulders, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Ven let out a breath, shaking his head. I can't believe that actually worked. Kane exhaled, voice quiet. Neither can they. He glanced toward the creature one last time. It watched him still. Then, it vanished into the dark. Kane turned back to the display. Transmission finalized. No records deleted. The witness remains. Kane's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. He reached for the comms, sending one last message before the silence took them. Solace remains. We saw. We will not forget. Then he shut the transmission down. The silent witness had spoken, and the galaxy had listened.